Ciao a tutti, it's Ario and today I'm going to be talking to you about everything there is to know about artifacts and traptrix in act format. Anything that I can remember since this is unscripted, but yeah, let's get into it. Artifacts are kinda the best cards in the format. Um, I'm gonna go over their effects for new players, and then I'm gonna go over matchups and stuff and minutia. So the two most important cards in the artifacts are Sanctum and Moraltach. Sanctum special summons an artifact from the deck, and Moraltach, like all artifacts, can be set can be set in your spell and trap zones. If it is destroyed while it is in a spell and trap zone, he gets special summoned from the graveyard. And fun fact, they do count as spell and traps while they are in that state. So if they get destroyed while you're under like a dimensional fissure, it still goes to the graveyard. And then all artifacts, whenever they are special summoned during the opponent's turn, they get to have an effect. Moraltach destroys a face-up card the opponent controls, doesn't target. Sanctum has a second effect that whenever it's popped by an opponent's card, either turn is fine, it gets to pop a card the opponent control, it targets though. So, but it can target set cards. And like, this is basically makes Sanctum a better back row in any way, in every way, except you have to run Garnets. Because like, you don't just get non-targeting removal for any face-up card, so even back rows. You also get a 2100 body, and if it gets blind MST, you also have protection. So yeah, but those cards alone aren't enough to make a deck great. Those cards alone are like fine, but I would not generally recommend any deck to just run those cards, because like you can get away with just running like 3 Sanctum, 2 or 3 Moraltach in a lot of decks, but it's gonna be a bit tricky. So, and usually not gonna have much synergy. But if you go for this route, you add Ignitions and Big Attacks and Double Cyclones. Basically, well, kind of depends on how much space you have. You can go for like 2 Ignition, 1 Big Attack, 3 Ignition, 1 Big Attack, 1 Double Cyclone, or 2 Double Cyclones. You can go for 3 Ignition. What most at decks run, at least nowadays, is 3 Ignition, 2 Big Attack, and 2 Double Cyclone. But okay, what do these cards do? Ignition is MST, but it also sets an artifact from the deck, and it also, whenever it gets destroyed, just like Sanctum, by an opponent's card, it gets to skip the opponent's next battle phase. And this stacks with Soul Charge. Stacks as in like, if they activate Soul Charge the turn that Ignition was supposed to skip the battle phase off, Ignition will skip the next battle phase. So that's very good to know going versus Artifact Traptrix decks. Big Attack, same effects as Moraltach, but when it's special summoned, you have to destroy a set card or 2 you control, and it's mandatory, but it's also hard once per turn, so that's actually a positive generally, because like blind setting Big Attack with no other artifacts is generally not a good idea, because if they blind MST into it, you get you have to pop a card of yours. So unless you're desperate and needing 4 bodies to block battle phases, generally not a great idea. But yeah, basically what you want to do with these cards is like Sanctum, special summon Big Attack pops Moraltach, and then you get 2 level 5 bodies on the field. Or Ignition, pop Big Attack, set Moraltach, Big Attack special summons itself, you summon Moraltach back. Double Cyclone, lastly, what it does is you get to pop a back row you control and a back row the opponent controls. So yeah, Some decks, like mainly Cyber Dragon Artifact, can run 3, but most decks just like the 2 copies. Then an interesting card is Chain Whirlwind, which basically whenever you can activate when a card in the field is destroyed by a card effect, you can then pop 2 back rows. So works very well with Traptrixes because those guys have a lot of destruction. So yeah. But besides that, they can just work like with artifacts to pop the opponent's back rows, which is nice, especially versus like control decks, because often you're using the artifacts in end phase, so they have a lot of back rows there. But it only works if you're popping your own cards, because in those matchups like versus Gilgas, they don't usually have face-up cards, at least on first turn. But yeah, speaking of, how do you use these guys? Generally, it depends, but you generally just always want to use them on turn 2 to be more aggressive, whether there's a target or not. Versus Gilgas, especially like you summon a 2100 beater versus their 1900 set, they have to finish chain it, but that only works if you just have the more attack, because if they also have big attack, then you also make play this. So depending on their back rows, they might not be even able to use the finish chain. So you're going to swing for that armor, and that is what you want to be doing instead of waiting a turn, because they have so much floating that it's not worth to leave their armor be. You have to get rid of it as fast as possible. Versus other decks like Artifact Traptrix decks, kind of depends. Versus the hands, it might not always be the best idea to use them, at least to use the effect, and you have to be careful about positioning. Versus the Traptrixes, they generally end on 1 card on the field, but it's not like it's important that they leave it on the field. So like, still, to be aggressive, you still want to use the artifacts there, but between Mermaleo and Card Car is a much bigger hit than Mermaleo. About Mermels, depends on how they go about things. They go slower. It's not that strong, but still, they are pretty scared of getting aggroed out early, so you want to aggro them out with the more attack. But since these are your MSTs, you have to keep in mind that what's best to do versus Mermels is to just save your MSTs for the Abysphere, and if you're going second versus them, you don't want to set your MSTs. You want to wait for end of main phase 2 to see if they use Abysphere. So if they do, you can just pop it in chain, and that's that. They don't get all their pluses of Abysphere. Then versus combo decks, it's like it's a trap. It's a good strong trap, but it's not as aggro as it is versus control decks, obviously. Yeah, versus decks like that often go for rank 4 turn 1. Depends on what they would be doing. If they would be doing 101 or Exciton, at least that's what you think. It's usually pretty easy to tell what the opponent wants to go into. Then you go for their bodies. If they're going to go into something else, generally better to go for the pops. Just keep in mind that if they might go into Dweller, maybe. So if your plan is Ignition into more attack, that might not work. So just keep that in mind, but kind of depends. Like, you can generally tell what your opponent is going to make if they have 2 bodies on the field. It's not rocket science. Yeah. For all this time, you're probably wondering, Arium, what about Sight? Sight is legal in the format. Why is no one playing it? Because Sight is bad. And I'm going to tell you why, because 99% of the time the opponent either has 2 bodies on the field, so you just pop them with moral attack and they can't go into the extra deck anyways, or they're just summoned a bunch of Bangases and well, they're gonna kill you next turn anyways. At least you took out one of them with moral attack. So yes, it is not great. And yeah, it's great versus Infernity when you're going first, but going first versus Infernity is not what your main concern should be. A slightly better artifact card will be Caduceus, but he's also not good because, well, what he does is he gets to draw you a card whenever another artifact is special summoned, so not himself. Which is cool and all, but it needs 3-card combos to get you any draws, so yeah. Unless you're playing pure artifacts, don't run this card. And yeah, even if you're playing pure artifacts, you could be running much better artifact mixes that aren't with Traptrixes. But yeah, I've been stalling for long enough. Let's get into it with Traptrixes. And by stalling, I mean just rambling on, because that's kind of what I want to do with this series. It's fun. But yeah, the Traptrixes are, well, of course, you have your 3 copies of Vermilio and your 2 copies of Dionia. There's also Nepenthes and Rathrax in the format, but as much as I love those cards, they suck, so no one runs them. Vermilio's effect is whenever she's normal summoned, you get to add a Trapple from the deck, and whenever she's special summoned, you get to MST an opponent's card. And the effect is mandatory, so even if they don't have any targets, it gets declared, which doesn't matter in that format, matters a lot more in Modern. Meanwhile, Dionia, whenever you normal summon her, you get to special summon a Traptrix from the graveyard. You can also summon the second Dionia. And whenever she's special summoned, you get to reset a Trapple from the graveyard, but it gets banished during your next end phase, which is relevant for decks like, especially Dragon Rulers. It might just be best to wait out the bottomless, because you don't want to get bottomless, for example. But what Trapples hosts do we run? What Trapples do we have access to? The 2 you generally want to run, at least in the main deck, are Bottomless and Traptrix Trapple Nightmare. Bottomless is super strong versus Mythic Rulers. It's strong versus pretty much every Rogue matchup and the Tier 2 matchup, but versus Tier 1 matchup, I feel like TTHN is generally better, because well, all of the Traptrixes are immune to Trapples, so they can't get Bottomless. And while it's nice to Bottomless an artifact, Traptrix Trapple Nightmare is better. Versus Girgia's Bottomless on Arsenal is great, but versus Girgigant X, if they use the effect, Traptrix Trapple Nightmare is just better, because it makes them miss timing, so they don't get the float. But well, if they don't have a Girgiano on the graveyard, the Bottomless is great too. Especially since if you search Traptrix Trapple Nightmare, they'll just not use Girgigant's effect, and 2300 body is still pretty good versus Artifact Traptrix decks. Especially since it's not an on-summon effect, so you could have just went with moral attack on summon anyways, so might as well just wait a turn and then use the effect. And versus Mermals, Bottomless is great versus Abyss Sphere, because you get to Bottomless the Lind, but besides that, Traptrix Trapple Nightmare is just a lot better. It hits Theos, Megalo, and if they were to summon Pike with Lind during the end phase, Traptrix Trapple Nightmare also just works fine. You do want to also side a couple of more Trapples. Acid Trapple lets Mermolio's wing over Gergia armor pretty much. It's more akin to swinging over it than removal, because it still gets to flip the armor face up, so that's not great, but it's better than nothing, I suppose. Also, Deep Dark Trapple, great versus Mythic Ruler decks. Bottomless is limited, so and Sylvans, high level decks. especially since Traptrix Triple Nightmare is absolute dog shit versus Mythic Rulers. So, and then a couple of other triples you might want to know the existence, but you probably should never run ever is Void Triple and regular Triple. These cards exist. Moving on. Now, what engines do you run with this? Because like Artifact Traptrix is a pretty small core, so you do want to add something else to it. Generally, never seen anyone not do so. If you played historically, what everyone was playing is 3 copies of Firehand and 3 copies of Icehand. That has kind of gone out of style. Nowadays, the main meta pick is Card. I'm gonna explain you why. Basically, one, the bank is decently strong versus the artifacts, but it's super strong versus the hands. So makes the bank a very strong card in the side deck, and that was picking a lot of steam during the beginning of 2022. Card has a much better matchup versus Girgias because the hands don't do much of anything versus Girgias. Hands are cloggy. They just are. Like if you draw multiple hands, they're kind of bad. And you don't really have any synergy with the hands besides just having more level 4 bodies. So, and your level 4 bodies aren't, your rank 4s aren't as strong as your rank 5s, so that's not as good. Card gets you to your artifacts faster, so you can get to artifact plays and rank 5. So keep in mind that card is quite weak on turn 3, specifically, or if you drew 2 cards, even turn 5, it's kind of bad. Because like turn 1 you don't special summon ever, so it's fine. Turn 3 you often have artifacts on the field, so you might want to swing for stuff, you might want to make plays or rank 5. So with card you cannot do that. But after turn 3, generally you don't have too much going on. You're just swinging and grinding and whatever, so card is great there. What is an upside to the hands that card doesn't have? Ironically, Hat is one of the best counters to Cat. So it's kind of the anti-meta slot. It's still a very strong deck. Just most people just play card nowadays. That's kind of it. Another engine that was played historically but has kind of fallen off, and I might be the biggest Firefist fan, but I'm also the most black-pilled person about Firefists in Hat format. That will be the Firefists, obviously. 3 bear, 1 wolf park, 3 tanky. If you want to run it, there's also gorilla and the 3rd bear, but I wouldn't run them. The problem with the Firefists is that they're supposed to have a good Girgia matchup. The problem with that is that, usually Girgias run hands and 3 Fiendish Chain, 2 or 3 Breakful Skills, Bottomless, Solemn, Compulse, stuff that can stop you from popping their armor, and if they haven't stopped you, you probably just hit a Firehand, and in that case you've probably lost the game. So yeah, Firefists are not as good as they seem versus Girgias. Then there's also, Curry Bandit that was also run historically, but no one is playing that now, and frankly, in my humble opinion, totally not biased, they've kind of just gotten replaced by Lightsworns, 3 Raiden, Lila if you want, Church of the Light Brigade, Rota to get to Raiden, Solar Recharge. You can also go the Celestial route, but I'm talking about just meta-relevant stuff. because there's a lot of Artifact Traptrix builds. You can play it with a lot of stuff like Ghost Tricks, Scraps, for example. What is it? Forgot. Psychics, Eccentric Boy, Card Trooper, even. Probably even Vortex Trooper. TGs. Like, there's a lot of hybrids, but I'm just talking about the meta-relevant stuff. The good stuff. And, you know, there's... the Raiden build is a bit more aggressive than the card build, but it's a lot more high rolly, obviously, because it's light swords. but the synergies between mill-based engines like light swords and Curry Bandit and the Artifact Traptrix is that they like to be in the graveyard because you do run a lot of graveyard recursion, which we'll get into shortly. But yeah, there's also Card Trooper. But like, okay, so generally, if you only have space for a couple of slots, you want to run a Curry Bandit or Card Trooper. Depends on preference. Tiger Soldier runs Curry Bandit. It's better turn 1, but it's a lot weaker versus back rows. Card Trooper's main upside over Curry Bandit is that like doesn't care about back rows because like obviously it gets under bottomless, but doesn't care about getting its effect negated because it may also ask cost. The effect is getting the attack boost, and you will still get the draw 1 eventually most of the time. So yeah, and it's also a lot more aggressive in terms of attack stat because you get 1900. So that's worth keeping in mind. But if you do have the space, Raiden is great because, well, even just 2 Raidens, 1 light charge is pretty good. But if you can get to run Solar Recharge, then you get to the good stuff because like Solar Recharge is such a powerful card whenever it resolves. The problem is that you might not always resolve it when you draw it. But yeah, and also I would say the Light Sworn Artifact Traptrix side decking experience is really bad because the side deck is so the main deck is so tight. But yeah, what else do you run alongside the Artifact Traptrix and whatever engine you chose? Oh. Let's get into it. Oh, I also forgot to mention that a downside to the card Artifact Traptrix build compared to Hat is that Evil Swarms fuck you up a lot more. Hat doesn't really care about Evil Swarms, Cat does, definitely. If you want to steal a cheap win away from a Cat Pro, Evil Swarms is how you do it, with a bit of luck. Okay, so what you generally will see in an Artifact Traptrix deck is, well, of course 3 Max C because it's a control deck, so you just run Max C because it's better upstart if you have the space for it. 3 Duality, non-negotiable. I think the only build that doesn't really want to run Duality is Worms, because Worm Sex conflicts with Duality. Also forgot to mention that's a pretty good build. Probably the 5th or 6th best build. Probably better than Curry Bandit. I mainly showed Curry Bandit to talk about how it fell off and how you can run it in other builds. Yeah. But yeah, Duality very strong because the Artifacts and Traptrix never special summon turn 1. Soul Charge, generally want to run 2 unless you're playing a mill-based variant, then you run 3. You know, it's a strong card in the format. It's Soul Charge. What do you want me to say? It's Soul Charge. A more interesting card is your 3 copies of Call of the Haunted. Well, if you run a lot of not artifact stuff, you just want to run 2. And, well, it also depends on the synergy, but with the other engine. But Call of the Hunted is one of the strongest cards in the deck, and it's one of the biggest discoveries done since 2014, because people back then were only playing 1 or 2 and for some reason, because they were stupid, I guess. Call of the Hunted is amazing. First off, obviously, all of your monsters get to proc of getting a special summon during the opponent's turn. Both the artifacts and the Traptrixes. Second, you summon Pleiades a lot, and Pleiades can bounce Call of the Hunted, so you get 2 pops out of that, 2 interruptions. Play this bounce and Call of the Hunted special summon Moral Attack and Moral Attack pop. Third, one of the best ways to counter the deck is Graveyard Hate, stuff like DD Crow. And Call of the Hunted can be chained to DD Crow to save your artifact. So, yeah, Call of the Hunted is amazing. Then, 2 breakthrough skills, Compulse, Torrential, Solemn Warning. You can even count Dark Hole as one of these cards of just staples of the format that you probably are running if you're playing any deck, any control deck. So they end up in Artifact Traptrix. But what about the extra deck? Well, the Artifact Traptrix extra deck is the first 13 cards are very easy, and the last 2 are generally just depending on the variant. So if your variant doesn't need to cut into any of these 13, that's great. First off, we have Play This. You generally want to run 2 Play This and 1 M7. Because Play This is pretty much the second best boss monster of the format after Felgrand. Some decks just cannot deal with it. In simplified game states, it's pretty hard to deal with in general. It's also 2500, which is beefy. And then if it runs out of material, you just summon M7 on top of it, and you get a bigger body on the field. You probably won't get the effect off because you need to wait a turn for it to activate. So yeah, there's that, but still, bigger body ain't bad, and you generally have the space. Then Volcasaurus and Gaia Charger. Volcasaurus pops a monster the opponent controls, inflicts damage equal to the opponent's monster's attack, and then it cannot attack directly, so that's why you stack Gaia Charger on top to attack directly. If you're not gonna attack directly, though, it's often better to just leave the Volcasaurus up in case it survives the turn, applies pressure. And then the other rank 5s you want to run is Zenmayo, Durandal, and Tiras. Tiras is very, very strong versus Artifact Traptrix decks because, as you might have noticed, they have a lot of monster removal, so yeah. Durandal is strong versus combo decks mainly. If you fear Soul Charge or some specific trap, Durandal might be great. And Zenmayo is great versus Girgias. Do keep in mind that you don't have to target 2 cards the opponent controls. You can also target one of your own. I only learned that recently, actually. But yeah, very strong versus Girgias. Decent versus other control decks sometimes. Not recommended to ever be brought out versus any Artifact Traptrix deck, though. But yeah, those are the best rank 5s. Meanwhile, for rank 4s, you're just your general 101, Exiton, Dweller, Rhapsody, and Black Ship. Just the best cards. Depending on the build, Cat generally runs Bragna Zero, Heartland Draco, Giant Hand. Those are the 3 most common ones, but you can run in any niche rank 4 you want. Hands, they generally do want the Gusto Emerald, and then whatever last slot you have. With Fire Fists, you want Tiger King, maybe Cardinal, Kagutsuchi, those are good. With Light Thorns, a couple of Synchros wouldn't hurt. Stuff like Stardust and Scrap Dragon or Crimson Blader. But yeah, that's your general extra deck of an Artifact Traptrix deck. Moving on to, Orium, if Artifact Traptrix is so strong, how do I beat it? Well, I'm going to tell you. So, first off, the main thing that you should have in general, because it hits a lot of decks, but it also hits Artifact Traptrix, is Graveyard Hate. So, DD Crow, Schoolmeister. Schoolmeister is fine versus the deck, but it depends on your main deck whether you would cite it in or not. Cycle Reader is great. Transmigration Prophecy and the Bank. Those are kind of your main stuff. Wouldn't really recommend Diffuser is just bad versus the deck, and Macrocosmos and Soul Drake can just get popped by a Sanctum into Moral Tax, so not the best. But they could be options if you want to. But yeah, the main way you hit the artifacts is with Graveyard Hate, which is kind of weird since they aren't really what you would think of at first as a graveyard deck. You know, it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's actually it. And do keep in mind that good players might just play more conservatively during game 2 and 3 because they know you said it in DD Crow. It's not a secret anymore. They know. They know. So yeah. Just keep that in mind that they might play around it. All of these cards and also Schoolmeister. Now all of these cards are weak to getting hit by Call of the Haunted. Meanwhile, Schoolmeister and the Bank aren't. You can just they can't just really. Well, okay, no, never mind. Schoolmeister is also weak to Call of the Haunted because, like, even if you negate the summon effect, you just chain Call of the Haunted, summon them anyway. But with the Bank, it's the only one that doesn't get that problem. But it's also the only one that doesn't also hit Call of the Haunted in return. So there's a bit of that weird dichotomy. But yeah, that's way 1. And way 2, because there's only 2 ways really to stop the artifacts, is effect negation. Chalice is very interesting in that regard because, well, if your deck can do stuff turn 2 and enough to care about artifacts and not enough to like say whatever to the artifacts like a Mythic Ruler deck might do. If your deck is like a Constellar, a Bujin, you know, a mid-range deck, then Forbidden Chalice going second is amazing versus artifacts because yeah, stops Moral Attack. You can play. You can maybe get rid of it with your plays. So yeah, very strong. In general, I've talked about this at length in my previous video, but Breakthrough Skill, the main reason why it's so popular in the format is because it stops artifacts so well. Yeah, like because the effects go off during your turn, Breakthrough Skill just negates them from the graveyard. So versus like Cat, it's worth using the Breakthrough Skill on both Cardcar and Mermelio earlier, and then you still have it in grave. So it's amazing in that sense. Just keep in mind that if they summon Pleiades and do the Pleiades Call of the Haunted thing, you have two things you have to worry about, not just one, so you can just blank their turn. But yeah, and keep in mind it's not hard ones per turn. And a general good habit I would recommend taking is whenever an artifact effect is activated, just check your graveyard. And whenever you're going to activate an artifact effect, just check your graveyard, but maybe do it a bit earlier so the opponent maybe forgets to check their own graveyard. Because like if you check their graveyard, they will check their graveyard. If you check it a bit earlier, just keep in mind if they have Breakthrough Skill, and they might forget to check and they might let the artifact get through. Those are some good old tips from me to you. Then we have Traptrix Triple Nightmare. Again, very strong for a card versus the artifacts. Besides Artifact Traptrix decks, the other deck that usually runs TTHN in the format is Spellbooks. Because Spellbooks get completely and absolutely fucking destroyed by artifacts like you wouldn't believe. Like, they just cannot deal with them. So Since they are too big, they can't really even hit them with breakfast skill. They have to rely on Finish Chain and Traptrix Sample Nightmare. Of course, Finish Chain is also a good card versus Artifact, just not great enough for me to put it as one of the counters, you know. And then we have finally Light Imprisoning Mirror, which is the only floodgate that is likely to stick versus Artifact Traptrix, at least for a bit, because they cannot just pop it with Moral Attack. It negates the effect of light monsters on the field and in the graveyard. Of course, there's also Skill Drain, but few decks can run Skill Drain. And they have to be big enough to beat over the Moral Attacks. It can't be just like Heraldic Beasts, for example, or Hero Beat. You know, you have to pair them with big bodies, like Eldritch. No, but Light Imprisoning Mirror. If you are playing a light deck, you probably want to consider running 2 or 3 of this card. But there's also stuff like Wiretap, but that only counters Sanctum. Yeah, that's all. I've gone on for long enough. This is actually the second draft. The first draft was the first recording was only 24 minutes long. Pathetic. I forgot to talk about the matchup spread and all of that shit. I always forget to fucking plug my shit at the beginning. But subscribe, join the Discords, leave a comment, ring the bell, leave the like, all that good shit, and goodbye.